TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this episode of Horns, the Associate Director of the Clements Center at the University of Texas, Paul Edgar, sits down for a wide-ranging discussion about the impact of the COVID pandemic on European governance. Paul's guests are Amanda Sloat of the Brookings Institution and the Harvard Kennedy Center Belford Center, Michael Moser of the University of Texas, and Lorinc Redei of the LBJ School at the University of Texas. Their discussion reviews the impact of COVID on such governance issues as the timing of European elections, the trend to authoritarianism in a few European countries, and interestingly and importantly, the likely impact of the COVID pandemic on the future of the European Union. Let's listen in.
Hi, my name is Paul Edgar. I'm the Associate Director of the Clements Center for National Security at the University of Texas at Austin. And this is Horns of a Dilemma. With us today, we have several distinguished guests. Amanda Sloat, currently a Bosch Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution and a Fellow with the Project on Europe and the Transatlantic Relationship at Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center. Amanda has served in several roles in government, including as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Southern Europe and Eastern Mediterranean Affairs. Next, we've got Michael Moser. He's currently the Assistant Director of the Center for European Studies at the University of Texas and a faculty member in the Department of Government and the International Relations and Global Studies program. Next, we've got Lorinc Redei. He's an assistant professor of instruction at the Lyndon B. Johnson School for Public Affairs. He is also the graduate advisor for the Master of Global Policy Studies program. And he has extensive experience in Europe, especially with the European Parliament, the elected legislature of the European Union. So welcome, Amanda, Michael, Lorinc. Thanks for taking time to talk to us. I hope you all are holding up well under current circumstances.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
I would rather be in Austin where it's warmer than here in rainy Washington, but so far so good.
All right. So there's never a convenient time for a pandemic, right? There's never a good time for this, but this was undoubtedly an inconvenient time for the onset and spread of COVID-19 in Europe and in the UK. In the US, we're familiar with challenges that the virus has posed to primary elections in places like Wisconsin, but what's going on with European elections and what's at stake? Amanda, you've taken a look at that. What can you tell us?
Well, you're right. I think that the outbreak of the coronavirus had raised a lot of questions about when and whether to hold elections. In places like Italy, there was going to be a constitutional referendum on March 29th. That was quite quickly canceled. In Spain, there were regional elections in early May that were postponed. North Macedonia was supposed to have parliamentary elections that were postponed. Serbia was supposed to have parliamentary elections that were postponed. Northern Cyprus had leadership elections that were postponed. A couple things that are interesting. One is that in the UK, which had actually been an outlier in terms of their delayed response to coronavirus, they came out very early with their decision to postpone local and mayoral elections, and they actually kicked them down a year, which is much longer than what other countries have done. It was interesting to look at the different responses in France and in Germany, for example. France was supposed to hold local elections on March 15th. They ended up introducing their much higher level of crisis response the day before, which led to lots of criticism about their decision to go ahead. They then decided to postpone the second round of those elections. In Germany, they held regional elections that same weekend, but they didn't up their crisis response until the day after, and they decided to have their second round exclusively by postal ballot. The other one in Europe that I think is worth flagging is Poland, which is supposed to have presidential elections on May 10th. And this has been causing a lot of disagreement within the country because the sitting president, who is up for re-election, wants to go forward, whereas the opposition is complaining that the pandemic is certainly not a safe time to do it, and it's also not allowing them to campaign fully.
So are citizens generally, what have you seen? Are citizens generally content with these postponements or like in the United States with postponements or at least discussions of postponements and mail-in ballots? This has become quite a partisan issue here. What do we see over there?
So far, what we've seen in Europe is that citizens have been content to have these elections postponed. Most of the ones that I was citing were scheduled to take place in mid to late March or in mid-April, which really was at a peak time for the virus in these countries. And so I think they were content with that. I think it is interesting to see that France and Germany ended up responding differently to the way that they were going to end up holding the second round. And Poland, actually, we're seeing the opposite debate, where the government is wanting to push forward with elections, I think expecting to win, wanting to continue to consolidate some power, and the opposition parties really are crying foul. So in most of these places, the decisions have been taken in consultation with the opposition parties, and I think citizens recognize the imperative of safety and security in the middle of this, and so generally are content. I think the question for some of these that don't have a date rescheduled is how long that ends up getting pushed. In the UK, for example, some of the opposition parties are objecting to a 1-year delay when the Election Commission had simply been suggesting 6 months. So I think content with the decision to delay, but we may end up seeing some questions if that delay becomes indefinite.
Well, I think to add to that, I think in some places there is already a political dimension to this, right? So Amanda already mentioned Poland, where clearly one side wants to get this election over and done with, whereas the opposition is hoping that what they expect to be a sort of coronavirus mismanagement could help them in the elections. In Hungary, which I think we'll talk about a little bit later, there's also a postponement of any by-elections. The ruling party has been losing all the by-elections that it's been holding in the past year or so. So they are very wary, and this is a good excuse for them not to hold elections. So I think that in some places it is becoming political, but I agree with Amanda that in a lot of places, especially in the middle of the pandemic, I think European populations have generally been quite respectful of and have been adhering to scientific advice that they should not be putting themselves at risk. So I think on that front, there hasn't been much popular unrest because of these postponements.
Yeah, and one of the things you're seeing is that you've got a bit of a stasis that's happening in some ways with the sort of political process. While we see these rumblings, or at least the beginnings of rumblings maybe, in some of the countries that could be on the spectrum of what we would now call illiberal democracy, and the way in which, as Lawrence pointed out, the kind of political nature of some of these decisions. And many of the other ones, it's the sort of willingness, maybe the benefit of the doubt, I guess is the right phrase, that the populations are willing to accept that democracy, sort of the normal democratic processes can be put into stasis for a little while anyway. I think Amanda's point about how long is too long, that's going to be the big question as we roll through the summer and into sort of traditional election season.
One of the Amanda, this is a question for you. One of the most influential assessments of the virus originated in the UK. It was co-written by several authors, and this has gained some attention here in the United States. Co-written by several authors, and the Imperial College of London published the article. It's got a long academic name, right? The Impact of Non-Pharmaceutical Interventions to Reduce COVID-19 Mortality and Healthcare Demand. What was the UK doing before that article, and then what happened afterwards?
So the UK has been an interesting case in terms of its response to coronavirus. It actually was one of the biggest outliers in European countries. Sweden has taken a slightly different approach as well from a lot of European countries, which we can come back to, but that was even different from what was happening in the UK. What was interesting in the UK was that Boris Johnson and the government were relying on scientific advice. So it's not like they were taking a political stance. It was very much science-driven, but it was driven by a different type and nature of science than what other countries were following. And in particular, it was much more focused on behavioral science. One of their concerns was that if they imposed social distancing restrictions, particularly quarantines and getting people to stay home, that people would end up getting fatigued with those measures at the very time when the virus was expected to peak in the UK, which was later than what was happening in some of the continental countries. And I think all of us who are still stuck at home several weeks into this in the US can have a certain sympathy with that approach, that people are tired of being locked up. And yet we are at a point, certainly in several states, where we need to stay home to flatten the curve. So that was the first concern. The second one was that there was a strong desire to develop herd immunity. And one of the scientific advisors to the government came out quite early and said their ideal situation was that 60% of the population would get a little bit sick. So you would be able to expose a large number of people, ideally to a lower level of the virus. The problem, of course, with that is that still leaves a lot of scope for a lot of people to get sick and die. And so it was premised on accepting a still fairly high death rate, and especially a death rate among people that had underlying conditions. So that was what guided the government's response for the first couple of weeks. And then you started to have a greater outcry from people within the public. You had sporting venues such as the Premier League football team, for example, taking preemptive decisions to start canceling matches. You had political pressure coming from other places. And at that point, the UK government ended up putting in similar restrictions to what we saw in other parts of continental Europe, but at a much slower rate than what others had done. And given the current trajectory, it looks like the UK is actually going to end up being the leader within Europe in terms of having the most infections and deaths, which really calls into question the wisdom of this initial approach. And in fact, we saw the Prime Minister hospitalized in intensive care for 3 nights, very seriously ill, his health minister ill, his Brexit negotiator ill, his advisors ill. So clearly the approach that the UK took at an early stage of this crisis does not seem to have worked out particularly well for them.
And just to add one thing to that, I think, as Amanda noted, there are different responses within Europe to the coronavirus. But I want to emphasize something she said, which is that all of them were essentially science based. They just had a different tolerance for how many people might get seriously ill.
Right, that's a great point.
But I think that is a stark contrast to the U.S. approach, where at least on the federal level, right, the Republican administration here was actually anti-science or making sort of decisions that were unscientific. So I think on that front, Europe was a little bit different than the U.S. But you still see that within the scientific consensus, they can still have different policy recommendations for how you want to get out of how you want to manage the crisis and try to get people to change their behavior.
Science is literally changing day by day. So we have sort of the early assessment. So the Imperial College model that came out, this is, sort of early March, when it was unclear really how this was going to play out. Herd immunity, there were people throwing around phrases like, this is just like a chickenpox party, that this will work out and everything will be fine. And now, sort of as scientists find out more and more about the ways in which this disease affects the population, not just the elderly, not just those with underlying conditions. Some folks, as we're hearing in the U.S. news, in the U.S. news media, generally healthy people who are suffering some pretty catastrophic, multiple system failures. That science is informing policy decisions. It is, and those policy decisions are changing as the science changes.
And you're starting to see that play out now in debates about opening up again. I mean, there was this general sense that once you had it, you were immune to it, as with chickenpox. And so if that's the case, then giving people immunity passports, allowing them to travel, some of that makes more sense. But then now you've got the World Health Organization coming out and questioning whether that's even the case, all of which I think just really underscores how little we actually know about this virus and its effects.
Absolutely.
Let's stay with the UK for the moment before we talk a little bit more about Europe more broadly. What about the status and motivation for Brexit? Right, that was the one when you thought of the UK before COVID. This was the one thing you thought of, at least recently. And the coronavirus has perhaps exacerbated even further the debates that we were already having over nationalist and internationalist perspectives. So on the one hand, this is clearly an international problem. Nations can help one another immensely by communicating, by being transparent, by helping prioritize aid depending on who's struggling at any given moment. But on the other hand, the virus emphasizes the fact that governments are responsible primarily to their own people. Foreign governments are not always transparent, whether maliciously or not. States do not have the same capacities or a similar sense of responsibility all the time. So does this emphasize and aggravate Brexit and the underlying motivation for it, or is it possible that we see the opposite reaction?
I would flag a couple things. I mean, first on Brexit specifically, I think it is highlighting a lot of the challenges that the UK is going to face in terms of coordinating, regulating, and responding to crises after it's left the European Union. Certainly a pandemic makes that quite clear in the sense that viruses don't respect borders, and that even if the UK is outside the European Union, there are going to be shared concerns that they're going to have to deal with. And so already with the situation with Brexit, the UK is not participating in health meetings with other EU ministers. They are deciding to leave the European Medicines Agency, which is responsible for the scientific evaluation of medicines. They've already withdrawn from the EU's emergency bulk buying mechanism for vaccines and medicines. And so it's very clear that new mechanisms are going to have to be put into place for the UK to be able to cooperate with the EU. On the EU more generally, I think it was quite striking that certainly in the initial phases of this, countries were very much dependent on member state responses. There was not necessarily a huge amount of solidarity at EU level. Countries closed their national borders, which undermined some of the Schengen system. You had countries like Germany and others that didn't want to sell their medical equipment or export it to other European countries. There was a huge debate over corona bonds and how to deal with the debt issues. And so rather than people looking to the EU as the overall coordinator of this, which is something that the EU in theory should be very well placed to do, given that it brings together all of these different countries, there was a very national level response. One of the things I've actually been interested in the United States is how similar that has been. You know, our states obviously are not individual countries the way they are in the European Union, but there really has been an argument for people to say our state circumstances are different, we should be treated differently. And to me, the starkest example of this was when this cruise ship was caught off the southern coast of Florida, and the governor of Florida was saying, we don't want those people to come in because they're not Floridians. So it's not just that we didn't want to help people from other countries. You had the state of Florida not wanting to help fellow Americans because they were from a different state. So I think there's been some similarities in the way that EU member states and American states have responded to this.
Yeah, we've got California calling itself a nation state, right? Gavin Newsom is very much sort of putting himself out there as the sort of alternative leader of this particular thing. I think you're absolutely right. And we see those subnational implications of this playing out in the UK. Where very early on, Scotland was raising a lot of the same sort of issues that they had been doing pre-coronavirus with respect to Brexit, but saying, see, the national government is having a really hard time sort of handling this. We could do this our own, so you see this fragmentation taking place, not just within the European Union, but sometimes, and you see this playing out in Italy with the North-South split. You see this playing out in Germany among the Länder, the states of Germany, that we're seeing fragmentation happening at all levels.
Lawrence, in one of our discussions off the air, you said something that I thought was pretty insightful that is related to the Brexit question that has gotten us here. You said that COVID-19 is exactly the kind of problem that the EU was made to deal with. It's non-political, it requires technical expertise, trans-border cooperation, and at least some continental solidarity. Can you explain that a little bit more? And then can you tell us how you think the EU has done so far? We've alluded to it a little bit, but can you be a little more explicit?
Sure. Well, I think what I meant by that is that the European Union does best when it is faced with a problem that is essentially technocratic, not terribly politically divisive. Nobody wants to get nobody's on the side of COVID-19, right? In this crisis, when it requires really trans-border cooperation, where this is, in the case of a pandemic, that's by definition true, and where the sort of policy levers that are required are a lot of coordination, technical expertise, and things that don't really get at the heart of national sovereignty, right? And so I had to come up 5 years ago with like a perfect crisis that could potentially galvanize the European Union into getting its act together again. I may have said like a pandemic would be it. And interestingly, I think that the European Union has responded quite poorly, in the sense that there's been very little coordination. As Michael just alluded to, there's been a lot of fragmentation. Each member state making their own policies, each member state closing its borders with its neighbors, each member state coming up with its own rules on social distancing or on what kinds of services and businesses to close, what can remain open. And you haven't really seen any effort to have a supranational solution to this particular problem. And what I mean by that is, even very basic things. There's the European Center for Disease Control and Prevention, and there's not even a way in which it can count COVID-19 deaths in the same way in different countries, right? So one of the reasons we have these differing numbers coming out from different countries and different fatality rates is because fatalities are actually counted differently in certain countries where there's a suspicion that COVID-19 may have played a role, for instance, in a lot of nursing home deaths, which unfortunately are happening. They code that as a COVID-19 related death, for instance, in Belgium. In other places, they don't, right? So even the numbers themselves are something that the European Union can't coordinate to get a handle on. Amanda already mentioned the European Medicines Agency, right? It was unable to have a Europe-wide inventory of where there are going to be drug shortages and medicine shortages for different kinds of medicines across Europe, so at least medicines could move around. So even these very, very basic things haven't been done, let alone some sort of European plan for, European Medical Corps, for instance, that would shuttle around doctors to those places where the infection rate is currently highest. So they could have gone from Italy to Spain to, probably soon the UK, where it's going to hit next. So I'm actually quite surprised at how little the European Union has done. It has been all relegated to member state governments to do things, and the EU has essentially just provided some funding to these national governments to use as they see fit. And this brings me back to Brexit. I think it's a very crazy irony, but the kind of European Union that we're seeing right now is one of a bunch of sovereign member states doing their own thing and essentially just concerned with somehow safeguarding the common market, which is exactly the kind of Europe the UK has been arguing for 40 years, ever since it joined. And this is the point when the Brits are trying to leave the EU. So I think it's really odd to see that confluence of events come together like this.
Right. Amanda, you brought up something off air also that I thought was interesting, and I thought maybe we could talk about this. We've mentioned a little bit how different countries have responded to the coronavirus, but let's talk more specifically, or perhaps you can explain more specifically what different countries have been doing with respect to the issue of surveillance associated with public health and privacy. Of course, that's a big issue everywhere. It's a big issue here. What are some of the different responses in Europe, and can we even tell much about the success yet, or the implications for privacy post-COVID?
The whole issue of surveillance and privacy, I think, is going to become increasingly salient as countries start looking at ways of lifting the lockdown and returning to some sort of normality. If you can get to a place where you are doing contact tracing, you have a better sense of numbers, a better sense of testing, better restrictions on people who are affected, it would in theory enable you to open up more easily the rest of your society. And I think if you look globally, the Israelis, for example, who are certainly very skilled at surveillance, were starting to do this quite early in terms of using cell phone data to track where people who were infected had been. In South Korea, they were also using surveillance information and cell phone data to be able to map out and put online where people had been. So if it turned out somebody who was sick had gone to your local grocery store at 4:00 on Saturday afternoon, and you were also there at 4:00 on Saturday afternoon, you would know that there was a chance that you may have come into contact with an infected person, and then you might need to self-quarantine for 14 days. With some of the restrictions in European countries, for example, in Italy, I think in France, in Belgium, people were required to print out these auto certificate forms that listed what their residence address was, where it was they were going, and which of the very limited reasons for being outside their homes was the purpose of their journey. Were they going to the grocery store? Were they an essential worker? Were they taking the allowed hour of daily exercise? And so this had the ability to inform police who might have stopped them where they were going. It also essentially allowed the government to track the movements of people because they had to enter into these systems where they were going. What I find interesting about this is it's quite resonant of debates that we had in the United States after 9/11. We were not having debates about health, but we were having debates about personal security and how much of our civil liberties were we prepared to give up in the name of security. When I was in the State Department, we were then having these conversations with European countries about tracking the movements of foreign fighters, for example, coming out of Syria into Turkey and going into the rest of Europe. And a lot of these countries, especially France, had long traditions of data privacy and were quite concerned about sharing information. That changed in Paris in particular after the attacks that took place there, where there was much greater openness at that point to start sharing information. And I think we're going to have very similar discussions in Western democracies about how much of their personal privacy are people willing to give up in exchange for government tracking of their movements, potentially in exchange for returning to normal at a closer time. So it's interesting to me that some of these countries, especially France, that had been most concerned about data privacy have actually been the most forward-leaning in terms of forcing citizens to publicly explain, at least in government websites, or carry documentation about where it is that they're moving on a given time.
Well, I think what's interesting, and this is, I think, a contrast to 9/11, and I'm really curious about this, is that of course, in the meantime, we have grown accustomed to private companies completely doing the surveillance on us, right? So Google and Facebook already know where we're all going, but maybe the government doesn't, right? And so what's interesting is, of course, this has been shown anecdotally, right? Just tracking sort of how many times people put in, symptoms of COVID-19 or fever into a Google and then geolocating that actually gives you a better sense for where a sort of big peak of infections is going to start, right? Better than a lot of other medical models, just because of the sheer number of data points that Google has access to. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how much of that surveillance we are willing to give up to private companies and how much of it we're willing to give up to state authorities. And there, I think there is going to be a transatlantic split because, as Amanda mentioned, for various historical reasons, there's a bigger emphasis on data privacy in the European context. And so I'm very curious to see how that's going to play out.
There's another angle on this as well, which is not just surveillance, traditional surveillance, but biometric surveillance is the next big step. So you're going to have biometric data being collected. I think, much more foreseeable now in 5 years than it was, previously, where biometric information will be encoded in some way. Scanners for not just temperature, right? The kind of classic temperature scanners that you see in many Asian airports after the SARS outbreaks of 10 years ago, but other sorts of biometric indicators that are these kind of national ID cards on steroids that will be following you. Like, are you, for example, immune? Do you have antigens in your bloodstream? These sorts of things. And so surveillance is, I think, poised to take a leap internally, not just external. And that's a quantum shift in terms of surveillance that I don't know if anybody's quite ready for.
Maybe one of the most unexpected responses occurred in Hungary. Lorinc, can you describe what happened in Hungary a few weeks ago regarding Viktor Orban, the prime minister? And have there been similarly unexpected or drastic responses in other countries that anybody knows of?
So I certainly think that the response was drastic. I would not call it unexpected. I think it's perfectly par for the course. So what happened in Hungary is that the Fidesz government and the Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán, had the parliament pass an enabling law on March 30th. And if that phrase rings a bell to you, it's because it's exactly the words that were used when Hitler passed the enabling law in 1933. So even the echoes of that, and by the way, it's the same echo in Hungarian as well. It gives you a sense for what he thinks he can get away with. And so that law essentially gave the government the power to define when the state of emergency due to COVID-19 was going to expire. And under the state of emergency, it gives the government the power to essentially rule by decree, circumventing the parliament, both in terms of legislation and scrutiny. And so essentially, for a lot of people who have been watching the slide towards illiberalism and authoritarianism in Hungary, this was kind of the last nail in the coffin. The things that I think are going to be interesting is how the government uses this newfound, essentially absolute power that it has given itself. And the first indications are not terribly calming. There's a new law that essentially allows the government to accuse anybody of spreading false information or any information that hinders its fight against coronavirus, and to jail those people for 5 years. So that's a big overt threat to the few remaining independent journalism outlets that remain in Hungary, mostly online platforms. There has been a lot of essentially military-dominated task forces installed in hospitals, and the plan is to install them in some other key sectors of the economy. So there might be some nationalization that we see in the future. And what has also happened is that Orbán has gone after the few remaining independent centers of power that remain in Hungary. And these are essentially local city councils and city districts, because generally speaking, people in cities tend to be a bit more liberal and vote for the opposition. And so Orbán has essentially decreed certain things that strip them of their material resources. We can get into the details; it's not that important, but essentially taking away some of their tax base, and so especially, of course, targeting Budapest, which is the sort of heart of the opposition that remains against him. And what's interesting is that there's been effectively no pushback, no meaningful pushback from the rest of Europe on this. So the European Union has offered some very, very tepid words that say, oh, well, we should all be careful of what measures we take, but it didn't even mention Hungary by name. Even the European People's Party, which is the Europe-wide political family to which Fidesz and Orbán belong, that political group hasn't taken any steps to kick Fidesz out of its ranks either. So what you're really seeing, and I think this leads into what Michael had said before in terms of the fragmentation and disintegration, is that this idea that there are certain fundamental European values that the European Union upholds, that kind of statement is growing more and more thin and hard to defend when you essentially have effectively a soft coup going on in an EU member state without any meaningful pushback from any of the EU institutions. So that's what's happened in Hungary, and I think it's really interesting to see this tepid reaction because, of course, the Polish president is looking at this every single day to see what he can get away with, and this is setting an example that I think might mean that Hungary is not the only one to introduce such drastic measures.
It wasn't even a tepid reaction. They gave them 60 million euros, right? Was it for, so I mean, and you could read this as a reward in some ways, right? I mean, instead of saying, hey, you need to, in order to get the sort of coronavirus funds, what limited funds we have available, both Poland and Hungary received funding with no strings attached. So yeah, I would go beyond saying it was a tepid reaction. It was an approval in some ways.
Well, and even the statements the EU put out, some of them didn't mention Hungary by name. And then another one, the Hungarians trolled the rest of the Europeans by signing on to it themselves, expressing support for, freedom of expression and free societies during this time.
Michael, let me use where we're at with this question to move into the next one, which you've had some observations on, and I'll start by posing this one to you. Are we seeing here the beginning of the end of the European Union? So are the wildly different responses offered by national governments a precursor to sooner rather than later breakup of the EU? Or is this really just normal behavior given the scope of the crisis, the the difference between the natural and expected differences between countries and peoples, and we'll sort of get over this hump and things will be normal again. What do you think?
Yeah, this has been literally the eternal question of the European Union as long as it has existed. Every time a massive global crisis hits, Europe always fails in its initial response. So historically, we've got some really big precedents for what we're seeing now. There are the twin oil shocks of the 70s, granted a very different European Union. I mean, not even technically the European Union at the time, but still a very different sort of geographic space. But still, the reaction to the oil shocks of the 70s, the financial crisis of about 10 years ago, you see the default reaction. And Lawrence brought this up, Amanda's brought this up. We've been talking around this, for pretty much the entire episode here. But the default reaction tends to be to go straight to national plans, national strategies that are very much first and foremost our people first, whatever we need to do to keep our people, in this case, I guess, safe and healthy, but in other cases, employed or whatever. And then only reluctantly, or maybe even only reluctantly looking at Europe for some sort of pan-European response, right? And so you see this kind of sine curve of the European Union ebb and flow in terms of Europeanness and then nationalism. And it really ties very nicely. It corresponds very well to these sort of global events that shake, the pillars of Europeanization to its core. It's we had the Eurosclerosis of the 70s was a direct response to the twin oil crisis, and not until the relaunch of the mid-1980s with Jacques Delors and others do we see, sort of the European Union find its footing again. It took how long for Europe to kind of come back online after the financial crisis and the sovereign debt crisis of the mid-2000s? And just when it seemed, we've got the new commission, we've got, sort of a new leadership in place, just when it seemed like Europe was getting ready to turn the page on this last crisis, COVID-19 hits, and we're right back in the same discussion we were having a few years ago about, what's the future of Europe. So yeah, this sooner rather than later breakup, people, that's the same thing. It's nobody's talking about when if the European Union will break up, or if the European Union will decline, or if the European Union will. It's now a when. There are very many, sort of discussion, a great many discussions out there who are saying, the EU as we knew it is over, and the best we will have now. Multi-speed Europe a la carte, pick whatever, pull whatever phrase you want from the dustbin of history and put it back in the discussion, because I think that's where we are right now, especially as this plays out through 2020 and into 2021.
And I think what I'd add is I don't think the question with the EU is not, is it going to spectacularly fall apart? That I don't think is very likely. Is it going to get hollowed out and essentially just become a single market, a completely economic actor without any political aspirations, which some member states prefer it would be. It's just that's a very different European Union from the one that was articulated from basically the middle of the 1980s, as Michael alluded to, up until basically the financial crisis, where it was supposed to be a political project. And so that I think is the big question. I don't expect it to spectacularly fall apart. It's just that it becomes, for instance, a non-factor in global crises such as this pandemic, or becomes a non-factor on pushing European values and human rights across the world. It can sort of lose that ability, but it doesn't mean that there's going to be a complete disintegration and we're going to go back to to 1918. That I don't think that's likely. It's more just that it gets hollowed out, kind of like the Western European Union did, right? Nobody remembers that organization. It didn't die spectacularly. In fact, it lasted for 20 years after it had already basically been become obsolete. So I think it's that's what most people are afraid of.
Well, and you said earlier, if that is the direction the EU goes, that's actually the direction that the UK always wanted, which is a much more limited economic trading system rather than a bigger political beast. I think this also is going to raise questions for transatlantic relations and how the U.S. deals with the European Union. There certainly is a lot of thinking here in Washington in policy terms, looking at the election in November 2020. If we do have a Democratic administration coming in, there certainly will be a desire to reset relations with the European Union. President Trump, of course, is not a fan of the EU. And so one of the instinctive things would be to encourage the new administration to reach out and embrace the EU as an actor, to answer this Kissinger question of who do you call to try and empower the EU to work with the EU on a coordinating level on foreign policy issues. But if what you guys are saying is right, and if that is the direction that the EU ends up heading, it'll sort of reinforce some of the trends we've seen with the Trump administration over the last couple of years to deal with national capitals rather than with the EU as a single bloc.
And I think what's important about that is that weakens the West as a bloc, right? In the sense that it's going to be much harder for a potentially new U.S. administration that is interested in international leadership, unlike the current one, to rally 27 different member states to its side. It was always much easier for it to go through Brussels to try and get the EU on its side. And so this, I think, is also going to generally weaken, for lack of a better word, Western influence in the world.
What about our bilateral relations, our many bilateral relations with the U.S. and UK, the U.S. and France, the U.S. and Germany, the U.S. and fill in the blank? What might the experience of the last 2 months suggest about those transatlantic relations post-COVID?
I mean, people have started to do some research and writing on some of this. I think one of the things that's clear is that the U.S. has not played the global leadership role that it has played with other crises. If you think about Ebola during the Obama administration, even way back toward things like the Marshall Plan coming out of the Second World War, the development of the counter-ISIS coalition also during the last administration, there has not been a rallying effect by the United States. And I think what we've really seen instead is a continuation of Trump's America First policy in terms of being almost predatory in the way it has gone after getting medical supplies for the United States. It has not been leading efforts to try and develop a vaccine that's going to be helpful for everybody. President Macron was the one that had to nudge Trump to convene a meeting of the G7, with the U.S. currently holding the chair of that, even though the French ended up doing a lot of the legwork to get it set up. So at this point, 3 years into the administration, I don't think Europeans are particularly surprised. But I think it really has continued to enforce the absence of American global leadership. And that, I think, is something that's going to continue to have consequences in the years to come.
Well, I think what's interesting is that after 3 years of this particular Republican administration, I think for national leaders in Europe, the U.S., of course, is still powerful, but I'm not sure it's that relevant. I mean, I actually think, if you are Chancellor Angela Merkel in Germany, looking at the behavior of the U.S. in the past couple of years, I don't think it is really in your best interest to be worried about what the U.S. is going to be doing, because it's unpredictable. It's not going to take a leadership role. So I think in a weird way, Europeans feel much more on their own on all of these issues. But strangely, they aren't coming together, which is what you would expect that they would do if they're on their own, because all of them individually, of course, are too small. And this is why, and I think we'll talk about this later, I think this is a moment where China has seen that and has stepped in.
That's exactly the point I was going to make. So great segue, because that's the first time I think the word China has come up in the last, sort of hour. And yet it is very much the underlying factor that we've got here, is that the United States happens to be, sort of now only one of multiple power players in this, and we are not taking the lead. Amanda brought up, sort of the leadership of the various administrations before. I look at PEPFAR, for example, under the Bush administration, as the example of the U.S. leading the world in a pandemic, multi-generational pandemic that I think COVID will turn into as well. And, sort of creating projects, funding, initiatives and really showing leadership on the health level that was seen by pretty much across the political spectrum as a sort of as nonpartisan as you can get anyway, in terms of sort of providing leadership. We're not doing that at all. In fact, we're doing quite the opposite right now. And so we see other countries are stepping into that gap. It's sometimes in a very public sort of way with, sort of flying ventilators on Chinese branded planes with Jack Ma, I suppose it was, who sent those. You've got many, the U.S. is not anywhere close to, not only we're not exercising leadership, but we're actually stepping back, as Amanda pointed out.
And the China case, I think, is interesting. And it'll be curious to see how this plays out in Africa as well as in Europe, because in some ways you have China playing the arsonist and the firefighter at the same time, with China, of course, not being very forthcoming in early stages of the crises about what was happening, about not doing as much and sharing as much to allow the rest of the international community to respond in a more appropriate way. And yet, as you were saying, they're very much coming in now as the savior of this. I mean, they had been doing this for a little while in Europe anyway, with the IMF and other financial institutions dealing with Southern European countries in the financial crisis, telling them to sell off strategic assets, Western firms not wanting to buy them. And so you end up with China owning the Portuguese electricity grid, the Port of Piraeus in Greece, strategic assets in the Balkans. And you now have China coming in and doing the same thing. There's been work that the German Marshall Funds Project, looking at China, has been doing in terms of diplomatic messaging that China has been using in Europe. And their messaging is very much, we are here to save you. We are multilateralists like you are. We are going to provide information. And European leaders are not dumb. I think they recognize what's going on. And so it's really that balance of how do you accept equipment that is badly needed in some of these hard-hit countries, even though some of the Chinese equipment has malfunctioned, and at the same time not fall victim to some of the politics and especially some of the public relations effort that China's trying to make in response to this.
Yeah, and I think it's instructive to see, right, that especially in Eastern and Southern Europe, there really have been Chinese planes landing with equipment, and there haven't been any EU branded planes landing with equipment, right? And that's huge, even just for the population. I mean, so in a certain sense, I totally agree with Amanda that China is playing both the arsonist and the firefighter. But they are the ones who are playing the firefighter, and the EU isn't even trying to play that, right? And that, I think, is really interesting because, as Amanda mentioned, a lot of this Chinese aid, of course, is problematic. But China is very overt in saying that they actually don't have any strings attached. They don't care how much corruption is in these countries before they invest. They don't really care how much, how many journalists are being put in prison before they deliver medical supplies, right? So to a certain extent, from the perspective of these European countries, it is a better deal. And so I think China is amassing a huge amount of soft power in this year, despite the fact that, of course, it was at the epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic to begin with. And I think it's really interesting. This past weekend, a report came out in Politico saying that the Chinese actually lobbied the EU, the European External Action Service, to take out a lot of language about Chinese misinformation from a report that the EU had just put out, apparently successfully. I haven't gone after. I just read it yesterday, so I haven't looked into the details of it. But that's really interesting that they're really trying to capture this narrative and redirect it towards the firefighting aspect of it, right? And I think they're succeeding.
Well, and that's where power, especially sort of soft power messaging, optics, all the rest, turns into leverage, right? And whether or not these if this is the indicator of something that's coming down the road, or if this is really just going to sort of fade away as COVID fades away eventually. But we'll see. I mean, this is playing out very transparently in Europe right now.
All right, so we've covered challenges to the EU, challenges to transatlantic relations, challenges to the global order. All this can be very, very heavy. So let's just take a moment for some levity, because there are some moments of levity in all this. Each of you've got connections around the world. What what are some of the more amusing reactions you've seen or heard of in response to COVID?
So I published an article in Politico in mid-March, trying to capture a global snapshot in the early days of this and the ways in which people were experiencing the same types of things and the way in which they were experiencing different types of things. And I think there were some interesting things that came out of that. One of those was certainly people's reactions to toilet paper. I think for everybody listening here in the US and much of the Western world, toilet paper was a huge preoccupation. And what I found was there was a big global divide between those who use toilets and those who use bidets. Those who use bidets could not understand this big obsession with toilet paper. There was also differences in terms of the use of masks. It's a very new phenomenon for many of us in the US to be walking around with masks. But in Asian countries, many people were already wearing masks to deal with air pollution. In countries like Lebanon, where a large number of women tend to get Botox, especially in their lips, masks have provided a new purpose in terms of being able to cover the lips that they have not been able to get their Botox refills in. The other thing I think we've seen is that people around the world really are maintaining a sense of humor during very difficult circumstances. And so there certainly have been a large number of memes, of music videos. Saturday Night Live, of course, here is starting to broadcast from home. In China, celebrities are making a lot of videos of themselves cooking and singing and dancing from home. We've seen the really beautiful scenes of people across Europe coming out on their doorsteps and singing with their neighbors, of clapping for carers within the UK. And so I think one of the things that's been quite positive is the way that people have been quite resilient. They have found ways to engage with their community, and they have been able to find some humor despite the very dark and difficult times for many.
All right. So sticking with the toilet paper theme. So I think for me, the sense of humor is just that I'm on parental leave this semester and I'm home with my 7-month-old. And so I kind of try to read some of these news articles about the terrible things going on around the world. But then he very quickly, my son makes me realize that really what matters is how many hours ago did I feed him prunes, because those particular things have very, very immediate effects in the toilet paper department that I need to deal with. So I think having that sort of really, really home-grounded focus right now of me being the sort of primary caregiver for my son has made me really appreciate a lot of potty humor on a sort of personal level rather than just on the global level.
I'll jump in with, I won't continue on this particular vein, but a lot of my Italian friends have been writing, and many of my Italian friends in some respects are sort of stereotypical in the sense of they really, really miss the evening walks, the passeggiata, and they really miss the community aspect of Italian life. And so one of my best friends, his mother, who is, of course, in the Veneto region in lockdown, just like everybody else, has taken to having a glass of Prosecco every night, walking to the end of the garden. So, sort of the Britishism there, walking to the end of the backyard. And right, sort of there, and the neighbor comes out and it slopes down. So the neighbor comes out to the balcony of that particular place, and she's at the end of and they toast each other with the Prosecco, and they have, sort of a little, sort of 2-person gathering at a distance of, a safe social remove. And then they go back into their apartments and they do the, sort of lockdown again. But so it is possible, I suppose, and we see this play out time and time again, to find these stories of the humanity that comes out in this, and the ability to weather some really remarkably difficult circumstances with grace and humility. And we see this play out, all over the world.
Terrific. Well, this has been a terrific hour. Thanks to each of you for taking time to be with us today.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.